These are the stories we share around the dinner table, tell in front of the campfire, and listen to on our porch. This is a place where tales are told and stories are heard. Grab your tea, your cocoa, your wild turkey whiskey, your wine. Welcome to Season 2 of the Storyteller's Porch, where we will be hearing tales of the farm with your host and storyteller, Jill Davis.
Welcome to the Storyteller's Porch. I'm Jill Davis, and I'm back here for our next episode of The Farm in Kansas. I'm here with Emily Chase Smith again. And today, Emily, I'm not even asking you what you brought to drink. I brought us a drink, a virtual drink of peppermint schnapps.
This is going to get wild.
So that's a funny thing to say. Does peppermint schnapps sound wild to you?
Yes.
So
remember, I didn't start drinking until I was 43. So
that is true. I do forget that. To me, peppermint schnapps was always something you put in hot cocoa. We had a local little restaurant here in Colorado Springs called J. Maurice Finn's, and they served something called Loco Cocoa, which was hot cocoa and peppermint schnapps and lots of whipped cream. And that was one of my first yummy girly drinks I ever had. And so I always think of peppermint schnapps as in my Loco Cocoa. But my daddy, he loved peppermint schnapps, and he would have often a shot of peppermint schnapps in the evening. And I say that often, that was well after I left home, because growing up, my dad did not drink at all. And one of the things I feel like I need to just address in this moment is I am almost 60. I'm pushing 60. My dad died 3 years ago, November 2018, and he was 91 when he passed. So I was well into my 50s, but I always called my dad Daddy. Now, we are not a Southern family because it's very common in the South to call your father Daddy. When I was 18, I went to my dad and I said, Daddy, I've decided I'm now an adult, 18 being the adult. And I look back and I go, oh my gosh, 18, so young. But I'm an adult now, Dad, and I feel like it's a little immature for me to refer to you as Daddy. Well, my dad and I had, one of those mixed relationships. We weren't super close, but I knew he loved me. And it was one of the few times in my childhood one of two times in my childhood, I remember my dad tearing up. And he teared up and he looked at me and he said, but I'm the only one who can be your daddy.
Aww.
You're the only one who calls me Daddy. I don't know what else I would be if you don't call me that.
Now I'm tearing up.
Yeah, I am too. I'm not sure his exact words, but I just remember sitting with him in his office at his business across this great big desk he had, which probably wasn't as big as I remember. But, my mom was 7 miles wide, and him just being in tears. And I thought, well, I can make my dad happy. And I never once again called him Dad. He was always Dad to me. And the funny thing about it is I have a couple of siblings who through my entire life teased me about me calling him Daddy and saying I sounded like a bratty little girl doing that. And, why would I call him that if I wasn't trying to be manipulative? But I always knew in my heart that I called him Daddy because he wanted me to.
Right. Yes.
So that was not on my agenda today to tell that story, but there we go. And that is the joy of storytelling. That is my favorite part of storytelling, is that it winds around places we don't even know where we want to go when we first start talking about them. So my daddy, not my Southern daddy, but my Kansas daddy, who moved to Colorado, drank a shot of peppermint schnapps very, very frequently. And there was one time when my sister, he had broken his hip and he was in rehab. And my sister snuck in a bottle of peppermint schnapps to him. And he would have a shot every night before he went to bed in the hospital. I cannot imagine if they had discovered it. So one of those things, probably not approved healthcare, but it helped my dad.
Right.
Last week was wild turkey for my mom. This week is peppermint schnapps for my dad. The other thing my dad lived on, which was one of the things that I grew up on, was construction coffee. So if you have never had a cup of construction site coffee, it is a unique thing. There is no Starbucks involved. There is a lot of boiled, long, plugged in, percolated coffee. And my dad had coffee and donuts, as many memories, as many times as I can remember, that was his morning breakfast. And that today, Emily, is our story. It is the story of my mom and dad and how the farm was part of their life as well.
Okay. Lay it on me.
So, as all good stories start with so, and then once upon a time, there was a love story, right?
Oh, okay.
And my parents' love story was their love story. And because we as children don't always understand our parents or see them the way they are as humans, we always kind of see them as peripheral to us. Like they raise us. They somehow they magically make clean clothes and food appear on the table, right?
Yeah.
And that's how I saw my parents when I was very young. And they never really told us how they met. It was just not something that they talked about. So these are the stories that I know. I want to talk about my dad first. My dad was born in 1927 in either Bird City or St. Francis. We really don't know. He was born on the farm, home birth. They didn't really log it, but I believe it was St. Francis, Kansas. He was born in 1927. He grew up on this farm way, way away from everything. He went to a country school and he quit school the first semester of ninth grade. What that means is in a country school is grades 1 through 8. And it's within walking distance of many farms. And the children would walk to school. They would have their class time and then they would go home. My dad started country school when he was 7, which would have been around first grade, went through 8th grade. Then after he graduated from 8th grade, he went for one semester. I don't even think he finished the full semester of 9th grade at Bird City High School. And his story was he quit because he read all the books in the library 3 times and there was nothing more for him to learn.
Wow. Okay. So I'm picturing you say country school, like Little House on the Prairie, one room schoolhouse. Is that?
Very much so. Very, very much so. And there were a lot of country schools. They had them like every 2 miles, all over Kansas, every couple of miles.
Wow.
Because the kids walked or rode their horses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't walk that far. And there were usually only like 20 kids in a school. And all the parents chipped in to pay for the teacher. It wasn't paid for through taxes.
Interesting. Now, is that because, and I might be asking you to stretch some serious educational knowledge here, but is that because they were more remote and there was public education, or was public education just not really happening at that point?
There was public education. My mom also grew up in that area and she grew up in the town and she went to school in town. So there was public education. But when I look at it from today's standards, the farm that my dad grew up on is a 25-minute drive from any small town. The closest town with a school is a 25-minute drive going 45 to 55 miles per hour on paved roads for a good chunk of it. Can you imagine trying to get a kid to school every day, driving that far? That's what they do now, of course, because there aren't country schools anymore. But back then, they were dependent on horses. My dad didn't have cars. He rode the mules or he rode horses to school. He sometimes walked. He rode what my dad called green broke horses. And those horses were horses that my grandfather had semi-trained to put a saddle on. My dad would ride them to school and then he would ride them home. But as he always said, the horses dragged him home. And more than once he woke up lying flat on his back where the horse had gotten excited to get home and had knocked him off the horse.
That's called barn sour.
Barn sour.
Okay. They just fly home.
Well, that's what those horses did. So that's how my grandfather survived the Great Depression, was he green broke wild horses and then he would completely break them and sell them.
Okay.
And so my dad would ride the green broke horses to school. The other story my dad would tell about the school he grew up in, the country school, was that all the kids kept their loaded rifles in the coat room. So there would have been a coat room and there was a shelf on it and all the kids would leave their loaded rifles there. Can you imagine that today? A coat room full of loaded rifles so that if they saw rabbits or squirrel, they could shoot them and they would have dinner. And that's how they, the first one out the door had dinner that night, was how my dad. Yeah, it's interesting. In one of our later episodes, we'll have a story of a gentleman who grew up in the 40s and 50s in Kansas, a little younger than my dad by about 20 years. But he talks about the rabbits and the jackrabbits and the squirrel and how he could never eat another jackrabbit stew if you paid him to. Dad felt the same way. So rabbit was not on the menu as I was growing up anyway. Most of us did not have rabbit on our menu as we were growing up, but my dad did. So that's what they did. So he went to school until the 9th grade, dropped out of school, and started his life as a farmer. He probably was 15 when he dropped out, maybe 16. And then he joined the Merchant Marines when he was 17. Went to sea. He loved being on the ocean. He loved boats at the time. And after World War II was over, he became a sailor. And he was actually a Union sailor and loved it until about, I want to say maybe 1949, when his father passed away and he moved home. And we talk about that a little bit in the very first episode of the Storyteller's Porch for this season. So if you want to know more about his adventures there, you can go back and listen to that. But then he ended up, when his dad died, he came back to Kansas and started taking care of the farm. That was where my dad was when he and my mom met. Now, we don't know exactly how they met, as I said. My mom's story is a little different. She was born in town, a town of all of maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people at the time. And she was born in Kansas. She was the first daughter of 5 children. I believe it's 5. Let me count through them. I'm going to say their names because it's important. So she had Edwin Carroll. Uncle Bob was next. Ed Carroll died very young. We talk about that in the episode about the appendixes. Then there was Bob, my Uncle Bob, then my Uncle Neil. My mom came next, Sue Davis, then my uncle, Cheryl Leathers, and then my aunt, Nova Leathers. And I said there were 5, and I needed to count them because Ed Carroll died so young. My mom didn't know him. He died before my mom was born. There were 5 siblings that she had. She was born in Bird City. I think my mom might have been kind of a cool kid.
Really?
Yes. She was a drum majorette in high school. And
I bet she had wicked boots.
She did. And I can remember being like in 7th or 8th grade, and she was teaching me how to twirl a baton because I wanted to learn, right?
Right.
And I remember thinking, how did she know how to do this? Because she was good. Like we had to go outside because she could throw the baton so high. She was good. And it wasn't until probably 20 years later that I realized, oh, my mom was not that far away from having been a drum majorette. To me, it was like centuries ago that she was a drum majorette.
Sure. Might have felt like that to her too.
It might have, after how many kids she had. She was a drum majorette. She was very popular. All the boys liked her. We heard a lot about that growing up. But we never heard how they met. My dad was a couple years younger than my mom. And my mom had that baby brother whose name was Shirley Lee Leathers. He went by Cheryl. And he and my dad were the same age. And I think they might have gone to school together. That is what I understood. They went to like that 9th grade, and my dad was in 9th grade. My Uncle Cheryl would have been in 9th grade, and they might have gone to school together. But apparently, when my dad got back from being a sailor, coming back to take care of the farm when he was all of 19 years old, Uncle Cheryl and my dad reconnected, and they might have liked to party a lot.
Oh, were there schnapps involved back then too?
I'm pretty sure there were a lot of schnapps. There was a lot of whiskey. There was a little beer. And so we never, ever heard how they met. Like we would ask, we'd be like, okay, Dad, Mom, tell us how you met. Because isn't that like a common story? Like I was married.
My parents met roughly. Yeah.
Yeah. And when I was married, we would go to dinner parties, and that was kind of like an icebreaker. So tell me how you guys met, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you'd always come up with a story, and you always had the same kind of story. Oh, we met on a blind date. Oh, we met at a restaurant. But when you ask my parents, they would be like, you'll never know. Or my mother's line was always, well, it was in a pickup.
It was in a pickup.
Yes. So we could never decide, was it in a pickup, like a vehicle, or like, did my dad pick her up?
Or both.
Or both, perhaps. But it was not until my mom had dementia and my parents were older. So they would have been in their 80s. And I was over at their house for coffee because I used to go to their house almost every day for coffee when we were in the same city, and I was helping to take care of them a bit. And we were just talking. I said, am I ever going to hear the story of how you guys met? And my dad said, probably not. But what he did say was the story of when he first knew he loved my mom. You want to hear the story?
Yeah, yeah.
It's probably not one my dad would be proud to know that lots of people are hearing. But it's a very funny story because my parents, I think, drank a lot before they found their faith and they became non-drinkers. So the story goes like this. My dad was in the back of a pickup out on a farm road, puking his guts out from having drunk too much. And my mom was holding his head and just telling him it was going to be okay. And she had a wet washcloth and making him feel better in the back of a truck. So who knows where they were at this time. And my mom, as I said, was very popular with the boys. And there were a couple of young men in the neighborhood, and my mom called them the Brubaker boys. So probably a couple brothers with the last name of the Brubakers. And the Brubaker boys came by and said, my mom was called Betty Sue at the time, and my dad was called Junior. Hey, Betty Sue, why don't you leave that loser and come play with us? And as my dad said, he said, I heard your mother say, you boys have nothing on Junior. I like him and I'm staying with him.
Oh.
And my dad said he knew in that moment that he loved my mom and he was going to marry her.
Oh.
Isn't that, I know, it's like a kind of sweet story, but also a little bit odd.
And I can see why you wouldn't tell your kids until they were, in their 40s.
Yeah. And it would have been in the early 50s that this happened, that time frame, because my parents would have gotten married in 1951. So many years ago. And they got married by a justice of a peace. And this is the story that takes us to the farm. So when they first got married, my dad moved to Colby. My mom and dad moved to a little town named Colby, Kansas. I don't know how long they lived there because we really don't have like all the details. My brother kind of remembers that he was 3 years old when they got married. He was my mom's son from her first marriage. And then at some point, shortly after my brother was 3, they moved back out to the farm. And at the time, my grandmother and my aunt lived there. And my mom and my dad lived there. Now, it was a 2-story, pretty good sized home. But I just think that would be a lot of people in that house.
And your brother too, right?
My brother too, the little baby. But somewhere between the time they moved in and 1953, my aunt and my grandmother moved on. I don't really know the story, didn't think to ask it. And this is, again, why I think stories are so important to listen to them now. Take notes, record them, because someday you may not really matter, but it may matter to a child or a grandchild. And we want that digital record. I wish I knew when they moved out, why they moved out, what happened. But they moved to Bird City. They moved to the farm. My mom loved my dad, loved him so much. And so I think the farm for her was an exercise in being a good wife.
Ah.
And it was a difficult life back then. First of all, life on the Kansas prairie is hard. It's windy, it's cold, it's dusty. There's not a lot of water. And there was one time I was with my mom at a museum and I saw this old 1920s, 30s style kitchen. And the woman was at the sink pumping water. And I'm like, I think that would have been such a nice time to live. Everything was so simple back then. You sound like my mom.
I was going to say, did she hit you or not?
She laughed and she rolled her eyes at me. And she said, you wouldn't survive one day. And that was one of the few times she told me about going out and breaking the water for the kids so she could bring water in from the well to give them baths and to drink and to have cooking water and all of that. So she was out there as an exercise of life with my dad. They lived there for a couple years, and it was in the mid-50s when it was a drought time. The farm is what's called dry land farming, meaning there's no irrigation to it. So you're totally dependent on the weather. And my dad just couldn't make a go of it. So he went to a town in Colorado that many people know called Leadville. And Leadville has mines. And my dad worked in the mines and my mom stayed in Kansas.
So is Leadville like lead mines, or what are they mining in Leadville?
Oh, that's a great question. I can never, ever say the name of what they mined right, but it begins with an M and it's some kind of chemical. I really don't know what it is.
Okay.
So that might be something we'll put in the show notes. We'll look it up. We'll put it in the show notes. But he mined up there for a couple of years, and my mom lived on the farm. And even
Alone?
alone and
With
without
Jimmy?
a car or a driver's license. She did not know how to drive.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So my dad eventually taught her how to drive, but she just hated it out there without him. She loved him. She wanted to be with him. Somehow they had 2 kids in all of this. So he must have come home on a weekend every now and then. It was probably about a 5-hour drive, 6-hour drive for my dad to come back and forth between Leadville. But he made enough money for eventually my mom and the 2 girls and my brother to move to Buena Vista, Colorado. And
Oh, I didn't realize they lived there.
they
Okay.
did. Yeah, they did. They lived in a place called the Stockade. It was an apartment building at the time. Now I think it houses a whitewater rafting company.
Oh,
But it was an actual stockade. It was from during the times when we were trying to, as a United States, protect our lands from the Native Americans, from the indigenous people. And they had an encampment up there. And so it was an actually stockade up on top of a hill where you could see everything. And my parents lived there for a few years. And then tragedy really hit. And my parents' 2 daughters were killed in an accident. And it was very tragic for my family. It changed the trajectory of our family. And that is our family history. Everybody has a family story that shapes them. The 2 stories that shape our family are the farm and my older sister's passing before I was born. And so from there, they moved to Colorado Springs, which is where I was born. My dad started his business. He grew his business. We're going to go like super warp speed forward because
it's like, whoa, we were in the 50s for a long time and now I don't know what's happening.
well, we went into the 60s where I was born.
Okay.
And then we went into the 70s where my dad's company became successful.
Okay.
He had a construction company. And then we'll go into the 80s when I left home and my dad became so successful that there was a small bank here in Colorado Springs that was specifically created to support small businesses. And my dad, with his 8th grade education, was invited to become one of the owners of the bank. And in my dad's mind, bankers were probably the smartest people out there. And although he never said that he felt like he had made it, I think that was a time when he felt like, yep, all my hard work paid off. And he became owner of a bank called the Citadel Bank here in Colorado Springs.
How involved was he with the bank?
The bank was really important to my dad. He went to all the board meetings. He was very involved in it. Now, was he involved in the day-to-day operations? No, he was running his own business.
Gotcha.
But he and the president and vice president were all very close. There's lots of story around the bank, which maybe at some time we'll come back to. I hesitate to tell too much of the story because I was off having many children and being married, and I was not really aware of all that happened. But one of the things that happened during that time period that was really good was that because my dad was the owner of a bank and because he had become financially successful in the world at that time, it was also the mid 80s became another time that it was really difficult to be a farmer in Kansas.
Mm.
And the farm went out of our family in around the early 1980s. I think around 79, 80, 81 or so, my grandmother sold it to another family in St. Francis, Kansas. And I actually had the opportunity to talk to the gentleman who purchased that land this past weekend. And as we talked, what I found out is that he purchased it from my grandma. And in the mid 80s, they just couldn't make it. Nobody could make it. Again, another drought, dry land farming, couldn't make it. So they went bankrupt. And the bank who owned the land, because it was mortgaged, called my dad and said, hey, Jim, and called my dad. They're in Bird City. My dad's in Colorado Springs, but they know who my dad is because remember, they all grew up together, of course.
Ah, okay.
And called my dad and said, hey, Jim, we got your heritage farm is bankrupt and the bank owns the mortgage on it. And we would like to get a little bit of our money back. Would you be interested in buying it? Nobody in Kansas has any money right now. You're the only person we know who has money. And we thought we'd give you the first option to buy it back. And my dad bought that land back for $14,000.
Okay, so we got to pause because we went through a lot of decades there. I'm with you. But so at some point when your parents moved to Buena Vista,
Mm-hmm.
then did grandma move back to the farm? The farm's fallow. Are people farming it? What's happening?
So first of all, you're not from Colorado. So it's Buena Vista, not Buena Vista.
Oh, it's not Spanish?
No, we prefer to pronounce our words otherwise.
So it is Spanish, but you guys just don't acknowledge it. All right.
Exactly.
So I'm sorry, I said Buena Vista, but it's
You did, Buena Vista.
like it's La Jolla.
Yes,
Instead of La
exactly.
Jolla. Okay.
Yes,
All right.
exactly. Although now they call it BV, so nobody says it wrong at all. It's all just BV. But so no, my grandmother was living in Goodland.
Okay. So what was the farm doing then? Because that's a long period of time.
Yeah, it was. I think that it was the agriculture area of it was farmed for about. There's just about I figure? There's about 20 years in there. So like from mid 50s to the late 60s, it was farmed. The ground was farmed, and the farmhouse sat empty.
Oh, okay.
So when this family purchased it from my grandmother in probably 78, 79, they thought because the house had sat empty for so long that it was just unsalvageable. So they bought another house that was out on the prairie and moved it to the farmland. And the house that my great grandfather built, they tore down. So they got in it to start tearing it down. They found out that the only thing that was really bad in it was the windows. And they could have just replaced the windows and it would have been fine. But since they'd already done all the transaction, they went ahead and tore the old house down. And so the farmhouse that I'm fixing up right now is a farmhouse that was moved there in the 70s, although it was built in 1933.
Okay.
So my grandma was in Goodland. The actual farmland was being farmed by a tenant farmer, and the house itself sat empty.
Okay.
Okay. Then in the 80s, it was purchased by another family. In the late 80s, my dad bought it back. And in the 90s, he put tenants in it.
Okay.
Now, the interesting story about that is my parents at that point had been married for about 30 plus years when my dad bought the farm again. And my dad wanted to move back out to the farm.
Oh, your mom was like, I still love you. I might love you even more, but we're putting our foot down.
Exactly. I think he might be channeling my mom today. So my mom was pretty adamant. And I can remember her saying, Jim, feel free to move out to the farm, but I'm not moving with you. My mom was a true city girl. She loved the shopping. She loved the people. She loved the restaurant. She played tennis. She did not want to move back to a farm 30 minutes from anywhere. So my dad rented out the farm, and eventually it ended up back in my hands, which is the story that we've talked about. And the reason, first of all, let's check in, because I do know this is like my history. It's inside out. And I want our listeners to understand and track the history. Any questions you have about this?
Well, I was just struck by, we talk about the farm and you've painted this picture, and I've seen pictures, and the listeners will have seen pictures. But I'm just struck by the extreme contrast of imagining your mother living in Colorado Springs. And, I've been to visit you in Colorado Springs many times. So I'm thinking of a very modern Colorado Springs. But, even 20, 30 years ago, that and the farm, like I could see how your dad might long to go back to it because it's so different, and how your mom would be like, that is not happening for the very same reason. And just how sometimes you'll tell me things or send me a picture, and it's just so the only thing I can relate it to is Little House on the Prairie. That's the only data point I have for any of this.
That's such a good observation. This is what I find every time I go out to the farm. And I wish that everybody had this opportunity, not necessarily to go to the farm because it's a lot of work. And on one of our last episodes, I will be talking about the invasion of the flies out at the farm. So
like a song that goes with that too.
Yes, exactly. But when I go out there, one of our mutual friends, Kim, always says, it feels like you've stepped into a time warp. And I often feel like I have jumped timelines when I go back out to the farm, because there's nothing to remind you of what's going on in the world. I have no cell reception, or very little. I don't have internet. I don't have a TV. We don't have a radio. I think radio still exists. We have a little bit of Spotify that we listen to, but only if we've downloaded it. So we listen to the same playlist over and over again. And
Which you would do like in the old days, you would have like 10 records or whatever, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly the same. And when I'm out there, it's very peaceful. It's very calm. It's very gentle. It's a slower pace. But after about 4 days, I find myself going crazy.
Okay. That's the time frame, 4 days.
4 to 5 days. And every time I hit that point of 4 to 5 days, and for me, that 4 to 5 days, we'll go into the city and have dinner at Big Ed's or something, which is a dive bar with the best steaks in the whole world, unsolicited advertisement for Big Ed's in Bird City, Kansas. So that'll break up the monotony. But I'll think about my mom. She was out there for months at a time with 3 children and no way to go anywhere. I would literally go crazy. Like, I do believe I would have a breaking point. So I have so much respect for my mom and for every farm wife who did that at that era, or even still do it. They're out there. It's a major decision to go into town, which is 30 minutes away, but it's like a half a day adventure. I live less than a tenth of a mile from my grocery store. I could walk there any day I wanted to. But to go get groceries there, you have to plan the day around it. And then I think about if you were driving home and had ice cream, how do you even get the ice cream home from the grocery store without it melting?
I think that's the saddest thing you've told me about the farm.
Yeah, I have not had ice cream on the farm because I don't know how to get it out there without it melting.
You must, maybe farmers were the ones who figured out how to make homemade ice cream.
Oh, I am sure that is true.
Necessity, right?
Yes, because as a matter of fact, my dad had a hand cranking ice cream machine that was from the farm. I might get an electric one just in honor of my dad. And we'll make peppermint schnapps ice cream.
Ooh, peppermint ice cream is my favorite. You know, I had some schnapps and who knows what kind of party we're going to have.
A little boozy milkshake going on there. It could be a lot of fun. So as I tell these stories, there's so much more layers to it. There's so much more nuances. But what I know for sure is that my dad and my mom loved each other. And the farm became both a symbol of the love my mom had for my dad in the beginning and a symbol of the love my dad had for my mom by not insisting they move back.
Yeah.
And so even though sometimes I think, why in the world my parents were married for close to 60 years when my mom died. Actually, it would have even been longer than that, but it was a heck of a long time, maybe 65 years. And I just know that in the world today, so here we go with our collective impact, we can get lost in the busyness of the days, and we can get lost in our self-development, and we can get lost in wanting to be the best that we can be autonomously in independent relationships, whether it's with our children, with our friends, or with our significant others. And I think my parents modeled the concept that love is caring about the other person's wants and needs and doing the best to compromise and balance those. Do I think my parents were perfect at it? Hell no.
Are we allowed to say hell?
Yeah, I said damn last time. Like, I'm really wild here. It's the peppermint schnapps.
Right.
But my parents loved each other. They cared for each other. And because of that, I'm able to have the farm now and continue to use it to build community. Over the next few sessions of this podcast, I'm going to be talking to some people who grew up on farms. I was able to talk to a gentleman whose great grandmother homesteaded in Kansas in 1906. So a little more about feminism than we knew back in the wild, wild west.
Oh, I didn't put together. You said grandmother. Okay.
And she was single. She was a single woman who homesteaded. So something interesting. I'm doing some research on that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And we'll have some stories from people who actually grew up on farms. The farm really is, in the 50s and 60s, they called it the bread box of America. I sometimes think it is the heart of America, the reminder of all of the good and all of the bad that we are as Americans. In so many different ways. And all is an archetypal word meaning more than it actually is. And yet it does signify the love that we have for each other, the joy that comes from knowing each other, knowing our stories, So as I tell this story, if you have a story you want to share, please go to thestorytellersporch.com and you'll be able to apply right there. Send me a message, however you'd like to. I'd love to hear your story. My story is interesting because it is the story of all of us. In some way or another, we all have the story of our parents, the story of love and love lost and love gained and hope and joy. And as we move forward in this season of Storyteller's Porch about the farm in Kansas, I am so grateful to have you here with me, Emily. Thank you for being here. Thanks for keeping me on track. The stories we share here on the porch are personal with collective impact. We believe we are the stories we share. Keep living your story and meet us next time here on the porch. And be sure to bring your favorite drink. And don't forget to tell your kids your stories. The end.
The end.
The end.
To learn more about this season's storytellers and to catch past episodes of The Storyteller's Porch, visit us at thestorytellersporch.com. To make sure you hear every exciting episode with Jill this season, subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you hear your favorite shows. We'll see you next time here on the porch at the farm, where I'll be drinking iced coffee and occasionally some wild turkey whiskey. What drink will you bring?